Chapter 16-17 Refinement. In order to defend himself if Old Fuddy-Duddy and Little Fuddy-Duddy came to drag him out of his bed in the middle of the night, Wei Wuxian slept while clinging onto his sword. Yet the night went smoothly. On the second day, Enai Huaizang came to him with an overjoyed expression. Wei Xiong, you really struck it lucky. The old man went to our sect's discussion conference last night, so we don't have classes for a few days. Now that the old one is gone, the young one can be easily taken care of. Wei Wuxian quickly climbed up, beaming as he put on his boots. A lucky strike, indeed, almost as if heaven is blessing me with its clouds. Jiang Cheng stood on the side, carefully cleaning his sword, and threw cold water on this notion when he comes back. You're still gonna get your punishment. Wei Wuxian responded. Why would a living person worry about what happens after they die? I'll just live freely as long as possible. Let's go. I refuse to believe that I can't find any pheasants on this mountain of the LA insect. The three walked together, passing through the reception room of the cloud recesses. Suddenly, Wei Wuxian stopped in his tracks and exclaimed, there are two little fuddy LA Jean-s. A few people walked out of the room. Of the two youths at the front, both looked as if they were carved out of ice and jade. Both wore the same snow-white robes, and both had sword tassels, which swayed in the breeze, alongside ribbons on their clothes. The only differences were their ambiances and facial expressions. Wei Wuxian could tell at once that, if the one with a stern face was Lain Wangji, the gentle one must be the other jade of the Lain sect Yu Jun, Lain Shishin. As Lain Wangji saw Wei Wuxian, he scrunched his brows, giving him a glare in an almost glowering fashion, as if he would be tainted if he looked a moment longer. He moved his gaze away and stared into the distance. On the other hand, Lain Shishin smiled, and you are. Jiang Cheng showed his respect with a salute. Jiang Wanian of Yunming. Wei Wuxian followed. Wei Wuxian of Yunming. Lain Shishin returned the salute. Enai Huaizang whispered in the volume of a gnat. Brother Shishin. Lain Shishin turned to him. Huaizang, a while ago, as I returned from Qinghe, your brother asked of your studies. How is it? This year, will you be able to pass? Enai Huaizang replied. Generally speaking, yes. He seemed like a wilted cucumber, looking at Wei Wuxian in a helpless way. Wei Wuxian grinned. Zhu Jun, what are you two going out for? Lain Shishin, to exterminate a water ghoul. We were short of hands, so I came back to find Wangji. Lain Wangji spoke coldly. Brother, we do not need to engage in small talk. This matter permits no delay. It is time for us to depart. Wei Wuxian hurried. Wait. I know how to catch water ghouls. Zhu Jun, why don't you take us along? Lain Shishin smiled without words. Lain Wangji declared, it is against the rules. Wei Wuxian, how is it against the rules? We used to catch water ghouls all the time in Yunming. Besides, we don't have classes these days anyways. Yunming was abundant in lakes and water, so it teemed with water ghouls. It was true that people of the Jiang sect were adept at this, and Jiang Cheng also wanted to make up for the face which the Yunmeng Jiang sect lost during this stay at the Lain sect. That's right. Zhu Jun, we'd definitely be of help. It is not necessary. The Guzielin sect is also. Before Lain Wangji finished talking, Lain Shishin spoke while smiling. Sure then. Many thanks for your help. Do some preparations, and we can depart together. Huaizang, are you coming as well? Enai Huaizang also wanted to join in, but he had been reminded of his older brother as he met Lain Shishin. Cringing silently, he didn't dare to have fun. I'll pass and go back so that I can review. With this act, he hoped that Lain Shishin would put in some good words for him to his brother. Wei Wuxian and Jiang Cheng went back to their rooms to prepare. Lain Wangji looked at them from behind, his brows knitted with confusion. Brother, why did you decide to bring them? Exterminating ghouls is not suited for joking around. Lain Shishin answered. The head disciple and only son of sect leader, Jiang, are quite well known in Yunming. It is likely that they know more than joking around. Although Lain Wangji didn't express his opinion, the phrase I beg to differ was written all over his face. Lain Shishin spoke again. And also, you wish for him to go as well, do you not? Lain Wangji was stunned. Lain Shishin, I only agreed because you looked as if you wanted the head disciple of sect leader Jiang to come with you. A silence fell upon them, as if the air was frozen solid. Only after a while did Lain Wangji finally respond. Speaking with great difficulty, there was no such thing. He wanted to defend himself further, but Wei Wuxian and Jiang Cheng already grabbed their swords and headed over. So Alain Wangji had to shut his mouth. The group mounted their swords and set off. The place where the water ghouls haunted was named Kaiyi Town, about 10 kilometers away from the cloud recesses. Kaiyi Town was connected with paths of water. It was either a net of rivers densely covering the town, or dwellings packed on either sides of the web like water paths. The houses had white walls and grey roofs, and the rivers were filled with boats of baskets and people. On the banks, they sold flowers, fruits, bamboo crafts, pastries, tea, and silk. Gusu was in the Jiangyan area, and all the voices one could hear were soft and gentle, as two boats crashed into each other, and a few jars of rice wine were spilled. Even the arguments of the two boatmen sounded like chirps of the oriole. Although Yunming had many lakes, there weren't a lot of small towns with so much water. Wei Wuxian found it quite interesting. He bought 2 jars of rice wine and gave one to Jiang Cheng. Gusu people talk in such a sugary way. How is this arguing? If they see how Yunming people argue, they might be scared to death. Why are you looking at me, Elaine Zhan? It's not that I'm too stingy to buy you any. Aren't people from your sect prohibited from drinking alcohol? Having only stayed for a short time, the group boarded 10 or so narrow boats and rowed toward where the water ghouls gathered. Gradually, the number of houses on the banks decreased, and the river path became quieter as well. Wei Wuxian and Jiang Cheng each had a boat, competing who could row faster while listening to events in the area that concerned water ghouls. This water path led to a large lake ahead of them, named Bailing Lake. Kaiyi Town hadn't been haunted by water ghouls ever since tens of years ago, yet for the past few months, people had started to fall into this path and Bailing Lake. Boats which carried goods also sunk without any reasons. A few days ago, Elaine Shishin casted a few nets over this area. He expected to catch 1 or 2 water ghouls, but got about a dozen instead. He cleaned the corpses and carried them to a nearby part of the town, only to find that some corpses were not familiar to any of the local people and remained unclaimed. Yesterday, he set up the net formation again and caught quite a few again. Wei Wuxian spoke. It doesn't seem like that the corpses drowned somewhere else and floated here either. Water ghouls are picky about their area. Most of the time, the only place they settle on is the place they drowned at, and they usually don't leave there. Elaine Shishin nodded. That is correct. This was why I thought that it was no trivial matter, and asked Wangji to come along, in case something happens. Wei Wuxian asked, Zhu Jun, water ghouls are really clever. If we use the boats and take our time like this, isn't it possible that they'll hide underwater and not come out? Won't we have to keep on searching forever? What if we can't find them? Elaine Wangji replied, We will wait until we find them. After all, we do what we must. Wei Wuxian, just by using nets? Elaine Shishin, that is right. Does the Yunmengjiang sect have other methods? Wei Wuxian smiled, but didn't respond. Of course, the Yunmengjiang sect used nets as well, but because he was a good swimmer, he had always jumped into the river and dragged water ghouls out. However, this method was too dangerous. He definitely couldn't do it in front of the LAN sect's people. If it traveled into LAN Chian's ears, he would definitely face another lecture. He switched the topic. It'd be great if there's something that can attract the water ghouls like a fishing bait, or something that can point out their directions, like a compass. Jiang Cheng spoke. Look down at the water and concentrate on finding them. You're letting your imagination run again. Wei Wuxian, cultivation and riding on swords also used to be just imagination. As he looked down, he happened to be able to see the bottom of the boat, which Elaine Wangji was on. An idea flashed across his head, and he shouted, Elaine Zhan, look at me. At the moment, Elaine Wangji was keeping a sharp lookout. As he heard the words, he looked up, only to see Wei Wuxian's bamboo paddle sweep up a splash of water and strike it toward him. With a tap of his foot, Elaine Wangji lightly hopped onto another boat, dodging the spray. He was quite angered, thinking to himself that, sure enough, Wei Wuxian was here to fool around. Pathetic. However, Wei Wuxian kicked the side of the boat which he was standing on, and tipped it over using the bamboo paddle. On the bottom of the boat, there were 3 water ghouls with swelling faces and ashen skin, tightly clinging onto the wooden boards. A disciple who stood nearby immediately suppressed the 3. Elaine Shishin smiled. Young Master Wei, how did you know that they were below the boats? Wei Wuxian knocked on the side of the boat. Simple. The displacement of water was wrong. He was the only person who stood on the boat. yet the displacement was greater than those of boats that carried two people. There must have been something on the bottom. Elaine Shishan praised him. You are experienced indeed. Wei Wuxian's paddle lightly glided through the water, and the boat's speed quickened, so that he was right next to Elaine Wangji's boat. He spoke. Elaine Shan, I didn't splash water on you on purpose. Water ghouls are really clever. If I said it out loud, they would have heard it and got away. Hey, don't ignore me. Why don't you look at me? Second young master Elaine. Elaine Wangji finally condescended and gave him a glance. Why did you come? Wei Wuxian spoke with sincerity. I'm here to apologize to you. Last night was my fault. I was wrong. Elaine Wangji's countenance was slightly dark, most likely because he still didn't forget how Wei Wuxian apologized to him. Wei Wuxian asked, although he knew the answer. Why do you look so gloomy? Don't worry. Today, I'm really here to help. Jiang Cheng couldn't watch the scene any longer. If you want to help, then stop chattering and come here, a disciple shouted. The net moved. Sure enough, the ropes of the net started to wobble. Wei Wuxian beamed. It's here, it's here. Thick, long hair formed veils of black satin, surging and swelling around the boats. Amid them, pairs of ghastly hands gripped onto the sides. Elaine Wangji backhandedly drew his sword, bitchin, and severed 10 or so wrists on the left of the boat, leaving only palms with fingers digging deep into the wood. As he was about to cut the ones on the right, a red light flashed past, and Wei Wuxian's sword was already back in its sheath. The strange shifts of the water had ceased, and the net also became still once more, although, a few moments ago, Wei Wuxian's sword attacked at an extremely fast speed. Elaine Wangji could already tell that. The sword he carried was of very high quality. He asked with a serious face, What is the name of this sword? Wei Wuxian answered, Suibian. Elaine Wangji stared at him. Wei Wuxian thought that he didn't hear properly, so he repeated it again. Suibian. Elaine Wangji frowned and refused. This sword has a spirit. Calling it as one pleases is disrespectful. Wei Wuxian let out a sigh. Think outside the box, won't you? I wasn't asking you to call it whatever you wanted to, but the name of my sword just happens to be Suibian. Here, look. As he spoke, he passed the sword over for Elaine Wangji to see. The characters on the sword, surrounded by lines and patterns, 2 ancient characters were carved onto the sheath. It was Suibian indeed. For a few moments, Elaine Wangji was at a loss for words. Wei Wuxian showed his consideration. You don't need to talk. I know that you definitely want to ask me why it's called this name. Everyone asks if it has some special meaning to it. Actually, there's no special meaning at all. It was just that, when Uncle Jian gave me the sword and asked me what I wanted to call it, I came up with more than 20 names, but wasn't satisfied with any of them. I thought that I could let Uncle Jian give it a name, so I answered, whatever. But who knew that, after the sword had been forged and taken out, these 2 characters were on it? Uncle Jian said, if this is the case, then why not let this sword be named Suibian? To be honest, this name isn't bad either, right? Finally, Elaine Wangji spoke through his gritted teeth. Ridiculous. Wei Wuxian carried his sword on his shoulder. You're such a boring person. Don't you see how fun this name is? It's especially good at tricking serious ones like you, and it works every single time. Ha ha. At the same time, from within the virid lake, a long shadow darted around the small boat. After Jiang Chen finished the water ghouls on his side, he was still watching out for any that they had missed. Seeing the shadow, he immediately yelled, It's coming again. A few disciples paddled and used nets to chase after the underwater shadow. Someone shouted from the other side. There are some here as well. On the other side, a mass of black shadows also whooshed past. A number of narrow boats dragged nets and went over, but they didn't catch anything. Wei Wuxian spoke. That's strange. The shape of this shadow doesn't seem like a human. It's also sometimes long and sometimes short, sometimes large and sometimes small. Elaine Zhan, beside your boat. Instantly, the bitchin on Elaine Wangji's back unsheathed and stabbed into the water. After a moment, it flew out of the river with a sharp resonance, taking with it a crescent of water. Yet, it didn't pierce anything. He held the sword in his hand with a stern expression. As he was about to speak, a disciple on the other side also drew out his sword, thrusting it toward a dark shadow which swiftly swam by in the water. However, after his sword went underwater, it never came out again. He chanted the sword incantation for a few more times, but nothing was retrieved from the water. It was as if his sword had been devoured by the lake, disappearing without a trace. The disciple looked like he was a youth of similar age as Wei Wuxian and the others. Without his sword, his face grew paler and paler. An older disciple beside him spoke. Sushi, right now, we still haven't determined what the thing inside the water is. Why did you act on your own and make your sword go underwater? Sushi seemed like he was somewhat flustered, but his expression was relatively calm. I saw that second young master also. He realized, before he even finished speaking, how unsuitable this sentence was. No matter what, the bitchin' sword or La and Wangji were not comparable with others. La and Wangji could enter his sword into water when the opponent was unknown and be just fine. But it might not be the case for others. An embarrassed shade of red seeped through his pale complexion, as if he had been disgraced. He glimpsed at La and Wangji, but La and Wangji didn't look at him, and instead attentively observed the water. In an instant, Bitchin was unsheathed again. This time, the blade of the sword wasn't inserted into water, but instead, the tip of the sword jolted and whisked up a piece of shadow from within the water. A pile of wet, black mess fell onto the floor of the boat with a plop. Wei Wuxian went on his toes to have a look. To his surprise, it was a piece of clothing. Wei Wuxian laughed so hard that he almost toppled into the river. Elaine Jean, you're so impressive. This is my first time seeing someone remove a waterghoul's clothing when they're catching waterghouls. Elaine Wangji simply examined Bichin's tip to see if there was anything strange, seeming to have decided to not converse with him. Jiang Cheng spoke. You should shut up. The thing that swam underwater really wasn't a waterghoul. There was only a piece of clothing. Of course, Wei Wuxian also saw it clearly. He just didn't feel satisfied. Without teasing Elaine Wangji a few times, he spoke. So, the thing that was sneaking around was just this piece of clothing? Now that's why the nets couldn't catch it and swords couldn't pierce it. Its shape was always different. However, a piece of clothing couldn't have swallowed up a whole sword. There must be something else inside the water. At the moment, the boats already floated toward the center of Bailing Lake. The color of the lake was an extremely dark shade of green. Suddenly, Elaine Wangji slightly lifted his head. Go back immediately. Elaine Shishan asked, why? Elaine Wangji answered, the underwater beings led the boats to the center of Bailing Lake on purpose. Just as he finished his words, everyone suddenly felt their boats sinking. Water immediately started to spread into the boats. Wei Wuxian suddenly noticed that the color of Bailing Lake's water wasn't dark green anymore, but almost black. Surrounding the area close to the center, a large whirlpool had formed. Without anybody realizing, the 10 or so boats circled around, following the currents of the whirlpool. They sunk as they spun, as if they were going to be sucked inside a gigantic black mouth. The clangers of drawing swords chorused in the air, one after another. Everyone mounted their swords and flew upward. Wei Wuxian already hovered above. He looked downward, only to see that the disciple who drove his sword underwater, Sushi, was already knee-deep inside the water, the board of his boat already engulfed in Bailing Lake. Although his face was full of panic, he did call for help, possibly frightened rigid. Without hesitation, Wei Wuxian bent down and stretched his arm out, grabbing Sushi's wrist and pulling him up. Having added another person, the sword under his feet dipped abruptly, but it continued to ascend. However, not long after, a strong force suddenly came from Sushi, almost pulling Wei Wuxian off of his sword. The lower part of Sushi's body was already submerged inside the black whirlpool in the lake. The whirlpool spun faster and faster, and his body also sunk deeper and deeper. There seemed to be something hiding underwater, holding onto his legs and pulling them down. Jiang Cheng originally stood on his sandu and calmly ascended to about 70 meters above the surface of the lake. As he looked down, he dashed toward them with an annoyed expression. What are you doing now? The sucking force of the lake became stronger and stronger. Wei Wuxian's sword was superior in terms of agility, but inferior in terms of strength. He was almost weighed down to the point of hovering right above the surface of the lake. He steadied himself while using both hands to haul Sushi and shouted, can somebody come here to help? If I still can't pull him up, I'm gonna let go. Suddenly, Wei Wuxian felt his collar tighten, and he was lifted into the air. He turned around to see Elaine Wangji holding the back of his collar with one hand. Although Elaine Wangji merely looked into another direction with an indifferent look, he and his sword carried the weight of 3 people and fought with the mysterious force of the lake at the same time. Moreover, their position was still rising at a steady pace. Jiang Cheng was rather shocked. If I went down to pull Wei Wuxian before him using sandu, I probably couldn't have ascended so quickly. and steadily. Elaine Wangji is only around my age. At this point, Wei Wuxian spoke. Elaine Zhan, your sword is quite strong, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you. But why did you pull my collar? Can't you hold on to me? I don't feel comfortable if you do this. Why don't I stretch my hand to you, and you can grab it? Elaine Wangji replied with a cold voice. I do not have physical contact with others. Wei Wuxian, we're already this familiar with each other. So how am I others? Elaine Wangji, we are not. Wei Wuxian pretended to be hurt. You can't do this. Jiang Cheng really couldn't hold it anymore. He scolded. You can't do this. Can't you speak a few sentences less? While you're held in mid-air by your collar? The group traveled on their swords and evacuated Bailing Lake as fast as they could. When they landed, Elaine Wangji let go of Wei Wuxian's back collar and calmly turned to Elaine Shishan. It is a waterborne abyss. Elaine Shishan shook his head. Then, this is going to be difficult. As they heard the name waterborne abyss, Wei Wuxian and Jiang Cheng understood immediately. The scariest part about Bailing Lake wasn't water ghouls, but the water which flowed in it. Because of reasons such as terrain or currents, some rivers or lakes often encountered sinking ships and drowning people. As time went on, the area of water would develop a personality. It was like a spoiled young mistress who couldn't tolerate a shortage of the luxurious lifestyle. If no boats of goods or living humans sunk into the water as sacrifices, it would stir up trouble and obtain them on its own. The people of the Kaiyu town area were all familiar with water, so sunken boats and drowning deaths rarely happened. It was impossible for a waterborne abyss to grow out of here. Now that one had appeared here, there was only one possibility, that it had been chased here from somewhere else. Once a waterborne abyss emerged, it meant that the whole body of water was turned into a monster. It was extremely hard to get rid of, impossible to remove unless every single drop of water was taken out. All of the people and goods which sunk were fished up, and riverbed was exposed to strong sunlight for a few years. Nevertheless, there was a method that could solve the immediate problem at the expense of others to chase it to another river or pond and let it wreck somewhere else. Elaine Wangji asked, recently, has there been any place which suffered from a waterborne abyss? Elaine Shishan pointed at the sky. He was pointing at nothing else but the sun. Wei Wuxian and Jiang Cheng looked at each other, understanding it perfectly. It's the Chishinwen sect. Among the cultivation world, there was a countless number of sects and clans, exceeding even the number of stars in the sky. And among these, there was a titan which stood above the others, without a doubt the Chishinwen sect. The Wen clan used the sun as the motif of their clan, signifying that they could compete with the sun for radiance, match the sun in longevity. Its sect residence was quite large, almost comparable to a city. It was named the Nightless Sky, also called the Nightless Celestial City, because it was said that there was no nightfall in the city. It could be described as a titan for the fact that no matter in terms of the number of disciples, power, land, or magical tools, there were no other families which could compare to it. A great deal of cultivators took being a foreign disciple to the Wen sect as a supreme honor. Based on the Wen sect's style of doing things, it was highly possible that the waterborne abyss in Kaiyu town was chased here by them. Although they knew where the waterborne abyss came from, everyone grew silent. If it was done by people of the Wen sect, then there would be no result, no matter how hard they accused or criticized. First of all, the sect wouldn't admit it, and second, there wouldn't be any compensation either. One disciple complained, Kaiyu town will be seriously harmed with that sect having chased the waterborne abyss over. If the waterborne abyss grows larger and expands onto the river paths in the town, all those people's lives would be up to the monster. This is so. If it became responsible for the problem passed to them by someone else, the Guzielin sect would definitely face countless troubles. Elaine Shishan sighed. Let it down. Let it down. Let us go back to the town. They boarded new boats at the crossing point and paddled toward an area of town where a lot of people gathered. After passing the arch bridge and entering the river paths, Wei Wuxian started to go at it again. Abandoning his paddle, he put one foot on the side of his boat and looked into his reflection in the water, examining if his hair was messed up, as if he didn't just catch tons of water ghouls and escaped from the mouth of the waterborne abyss. Wei Wuxian assuredly threw a series of charming winks at both sides of the path. Sisters, how much for half a kilogram of loquats? His age was young, and his appearance was handsome. With such high spirits, it really was a scene of frivolous peach blossoms pursuing the running stream. One woman lifted her bamboo hat, smiling with her head raised. Young Bo, you needn't pay. How about I can give you one for free? The Wu dialect was soft, sounding refreshing and sweet. The speaker's lips moved melodiously, and the listener's ears would be enveloped in fragrance. Wei Wuxian cupped his hands together. If it's given to me by sister, then I definitely want it. The woman put her hand into the basket and threw him a round golden loquat. You needn't be such polite. It's for how handsome you look. The boats moved at a fast speed. As the two boats met, they immediately passed each other. Wei Wuxian turned around, perfectly catching it, and grinned. Sister looks even prettier. As he showed off and flirted on the side, Elaine Wangji was staring straight ahead, appearing quite virtuous. Wei Wuxian smugly tossed the toquet in his hand and suddenly pointed at him. Sisters, do you think that he looks handsome? Elaine Wangji didn't expect Wei Wuxian to suddenly talk about him at all. Just as he was unsure of how to respond, the women on the river spoke in harmony. Even more handsome. Amid this, there seemed to be the laughter of a few men. Wei Wuxian spoke. Then, does anyone want to give him one? If you only give me and not him, I am afraid he might be jealous when we go back. Chirp-like laughter echoed through the whole river. Another woman came from in front of them, standing on her boat. Okay, you get two. Heads up, young Bo, catch. After the second one also landed in his hand, Wei Wuxian shouted, Sister, you are not only pretty, but you are nice as well. The next time I come here, I'm gonna buy a whole basket. The woman's voice was vibrant, and she was more daring than the other. She pointed at Elaine Wangji. Get him to come as well. You all can come here and get them. Wei Wuxian held the loquat in front of Elaine Wangji's eyes. Elaine Wangji didn't move his gaze. Move, and so, Wei Wuxian moved it away. I knew that you definitely wouldn't accept it, so I never intended to give it to you. Jiangcheng, catch. Just then, the boat which Jiangcheng was onward passed. He caught the loquat with one hand, a slight smile appearing on his face, but immediately snorted. You're being all flirty again. Wei Wuxian smirked, proud of his success. Get lost. Then, he turned around and asked, Elaine Zhan, you're from Gusu, so you know how to speak in this dialect, right? Teach me. How do you swear in the Gusu dialect? Elaine Wangji threw a pathetic at him and got on another boat. Wei Wuxian didn't expect him to really answer. He just wanted to tease him. After hearing the amusingly soft Gusu dialect and thinking that Elaine Wangji undoubtedly also spoke this dialect when he was young. After raising his head to swallow another gulp of the rice wine, he carried the plump, jet-black jar in one hand, picked up the paddle, and charged over to beat up Jiangcheng. On the other hand, Elaine Wangji stood side by side to Elaine Shishan. This time, even their expressions were similar. Both looked as if they were preoccupied by troubles as they thought about things such as how to deal with the waterborne abyss, and what to say to the mayor of Kaiyu Town. An extremely heavy boat came from in front of them, filled with buckets of large golden loquats. Elaine Wangji took one glance at it, and continued to look straight ahead. Yet, Elaine Shishan spoke to him. If you want to eat loquats, should we buy one basket? Elaine Wangji went off with a flick of his sleeves. I do not. He went to stand on another boat,